I've met someone else. And I'm moving out tonight, Wyatt said casually, his voice low but clear enough to cut through the hum of conversation and soft acoustic guitar playing in the background. I froze mid-bite, my fork suspended in the air, the rosemary lamb untouched on my plate. The wine in my glass rippled slightly, catching the glow of the fairy lights strung above the vineyard's wooden trellis. It was dusk, that soft, golden moment when everything feels almost sacred. We were sitting at a long family-style table, nestled under the open North Carolina sky, surrounded by our closest friends and family. The engagement dinner for our son, Aiden, had just hit its stride. Laughter, toasts, smiles. I had spent weeks organizing it. The lavender centerpieces, the handwritten menus, the custom wine labels with the couple's initials. I wanted it to be perfect. And this was the moment Wyatt Colburn, my husband of 28 years, had chosen to detonate a bomb. Across the table, our soon-to-be daughter-in-law, Emily, looked like she'd seen a ghost. Aiden dropped his napkin in his lap, mouth slightly open, and I could feel the sharp weight of every glance shifting toward me. 70 guests. Colleagues. Neighbors. Our church pastor. Even Wyatt's medical partners. The air thinned around me. My ears rang, but I kept my eyes on my husband. His expression was smug, satisfied, even like he'd rehearsed this. Like he believed that dropping this on me in public would somehow force me into silence. Force me into shame. That's the thing about men like Wyatt. They mistake cruelty for control. They mistake timing for dominance. And they think that because they wear tailored suits and speak in calm, educated tones, no one will call them what they are, cowards. But what Wyatt didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that I had been preparing for this moment for months. I set my fork down quietly and reached for my champagne flute with a steady hand. I stood, brushing the soft silk of my cornflower blue dress, the one I bought for this evening because it made me feel strong, powerful, and free. "I'm glad you brought this up," I said, my voice clear and smooth, cutting through the shocked silence like a violin string drawn taut. "Because I have an announcement, too." Wyatt's smirk wavered. "I'm also seeing someone," I said, pausing just long enough to let the words land. "And I'm leaving you, too." Gasps rippled across the table. A fork clattered. Someone coughed awkwardly. Wyatt blinked. "What?" I looked straight into his eyes. "His name is Archer Langley." His face lost color instantly. "You're joking." I tilted my head slightly. "You know Archer, don't you? He's the new chief operating officer at Asheville General. Your boss." Murmurs broke out around us, low and disbelieving. Someone whispered, "Is she serious?" Wyatt's jaw clenched. "That's not possible." But he knew it was. 'Cause Archer Langley was very real. And unlike Wyatt, Archer knew how to treat a woman with respect. He also happened to be 10 years younger, emotionally available, and the only man in a decade who'd ever looked at me like I was more than just an extension of his brand. "Oh," I added lightly, raising my glass in a mock toast, "and I've accepted the board's offer. I'll be relocating to Boston next month to head the hospital's new development wing." I heard someone exhale, sharply. A hand covered a mouth in shock. Even the servers paused with trays midair, unsure whether they were witnessing gossip or the opening scene of a courtroom drama. Across the table, Aiden looked at me, not with embarrassment but with quiet awe. Wyatt, on the other hand, looked like a man who had just been handed a grenade with the pin already pulled. "You can't be serious," he said, voice cracking just slightly. "You've been planning this?" I lowered my glass and met his eyes. "For a while now, yes." He opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. Around us, the entire table had gone silent. The only sound was the distant buzz of cicadas and the soft clink of silverware against porcelain as the servers awkwardly continued clearing salad plates. Wyatt had always believed I was too timid, too polite, too afraid to stand up to him. He thought I'd play the part of the scorned wife, crumbling under the weight of public shame. But what he didn't understand and never bothered to learn is that I don't break. I sharpen. I looked at Aiden and Emily and gave them a warm, steady smile. "I'm sorry this had to happen tonight," I said sincerely. "But I won't apologize for standing up for myself. You deserve to start your life in a family built on truth." Aiden nodded slowly, and I saw something shift in his expression, a kind of respect that made my heart swell with pride. My son, a man now, watching his mother reclaim her voice. As I stepped away from the table, the murmurs rose again, a mixture of confusion, admiration, and shock. I didn't look back at Wyatt. He had made his announcement, and I had made mine. Only difference? Mine had teeth. My name is Jules Calderwood. I'm 53 years old. I was born in Durham, North Carolina, but have lived most of my adult life in Asheville, a city tucked into the Blue Ridge Mountains, known for its art, its independent spirit, and its endless green. I'm a grant strategist. Not glamorous, but powerful in its own quiet way. I help medical research facilities get funded, cancer studies, trauma programs, pediatric innovations. I build narratives from raw data. I tell the stories that bring in millions. I wasn't always this composed. There was a time I would have stuttered through a dinner order, let alone stood up at a 70-person engagement party and publicly dismantled my husband's ego. But that's what 28 years of subtle erosion will do. Not break you necessarily, but strip away the parts of yourself you don't protect. And for a long time, I didn't protect much. Wyatt and I met in college at UNC Chapel Hill. He was pre-med, I was majoring in literature with a minor in public health. He was tall, confident, southern charming. Kind of man who wore confidence like cologne and pulled people into his orbit without even trying. I fell for him fast. Like a textbook. He'd bring me coffee to the library, walk me home at night with his hand on the small of my back like it was a promise. He said things like, "You make me smarter just by sitting next to me," and I believed him. Because I was 22 and had no reason not to. We married 2 weeks after graduation. I was in love and naive and wanted nothing more than to build a life together. We moved to Asheville so he could begin his residency at the hospital, and I took a job writing grants for the local cancer center. First, we were a team. He worked long shifts, I managed our tiny apartment, and we'd spend Sundays hiking the trails near Pisgah Forest, dreaming about the home we'd buy someday. But somewhere along the way, things shifted. Not suddenly. Quietly. Like fog rolling in. First it was small. Wyatt corrected me in front of friends more often, little things like a date I got wrong or a statistic I misquoted. His jokes started carrying an edge. "That's not Jules' thing," he'd say when I brought up a professional opportunity. "She's more of a behind-the-scenes person." I brushed it off. Told myself it was stress. He was building a career in orthopedic surgery. I wanted to be supportive. That's what wives do, right? Then came the pregnancies. 2 in 4 years. Our son Aiden was born just before Wyatt made partner, and I stayed home for 2 years after that, partially by choice, partially because Wyatt insisted we didn't need the extra income. "You have the luxury of being with him," he'd say. Most women would kill for that. Sounded noble. Until I realized he meant it as, "Don't try to be more than you are." When I went back to work part-time, he barely acknowledged it. Never asked about my projects. Never read anything I wrote. When I landed a multi-million-dollar grant for a statewide mental health initiative, he called it a nice little win. As if I'd just won a church raffle. At parties, I became Wyatt's wife. Not Jules. Not strategist, writer, analyst. Just Mrs. Colburn. I remember one evening especially, a hospital fundraiser we attended 5 or 6 years ago. I had been the one to draft the keynote speech for the chair of the board. I'd written it over 2 weekends, digging into every success metric, every patient story, shaping it into something that felt meaningful. When the speech ended to thunderous applause, Wyatt leaned in and whispered, "You're beaming like you wrote it." "I did write it," I said, surprised. He just chuckled and shook his head. No one's here for that kind of thing, Jules. It wasn't just professional. At home, his affection grew sparse. Conversations became transactional. Dinners turned into him scrolling his phone while I cleaned up alone. When I bought a new dress or got my hair colored, he didn't notice. When I asked about us, really asked, he'd say, "You worry too much," or worse, "Let's not make problems where there aren't any." And then there were the signs. The gym bag that stayed in his car overnight. The late emergency surgeries that happened 3 times a week. The sudden need to lock his phone. Change his passwords. The calls he took on the back porch with the door shut, even in January. I didn't need proof. Women always know. In our bones. Till I said nothing. 'Cause I was afraid. Afraid of the silence that might follow the confrontation. Afraid of losing the illusion. Of breaking the life I had spent decades building. And then came Aiden. He came home for Christmas break last year, and one night while we were making tea, he said, "Mom, do you still love Dad?" I was taken aback. Of course. Why? He shrugged but didn't meet my eyes. You don't look at each other anymore. You don't talk. And you never laugh like you used to. I see how hard you work, and I don't know if he even sees it. That moment cracked something in me. Hearing it from my son, not in judgment but in quiet recognition, made me realize how invisible I had allowed myself to become. Aiden planted the seed. But Archer Langley was the sunlight that helped it grow. He came into my life last spring, newly appointed as COO of the hospital. We met during a grant review meeting. He was sharp, composed, and shockingly attentive. When I spoke, he looked at me like every word mattered. We ran into each other again a week later at a hospital alumni luncheon. He remembered details from our first meeting. Even quoted something I'd said. When he asked if I wanted to grab coffee sometime, just to talk about strategy, I said yes. And then I said yes again and again. And somewhere along the way, those coffees turned into walks, and those walks turned into long conversations about everything I had locked away in myself for years. He never touched me inappropriately. Never crossed a line. But he saw me. He heard me. He asked questions like, "What kind of writing would you do if you didn't have to worry about paychecks or prestige?" And I'd sit there, stunned, because no one had asked me that in 20 years. When Archer told me the hospital board was creating a research division in Boston and that he wanted me to lead it, not because I was his interest, but because I was the best person for the job, I wept in my car for an hour after that meeting. Not because I was afraid, but because I felt alive. That's when I began planning. Not a scheme. Not revenge. Just a path forward. I started packing boxes when Wyatt was at work. Scanning leases in Cambridge on my lunch breaks. And on the day of Aiden's engagement announcement, when I saw Wyatt acting like the perfect father, shaking hands, toasting with charm, bragging about his surgical innovations like nothing in the world was fractured, I knew he was going to do it. I saw it in the way he avoided my eye contact. The glances between him and that nurse, Kelsey, the one I'd caught him texting with 6 months prior. He thought he was going to humiliate me. He thought I'd stand there, wilted and ruined, while he pranced off into his midlife fantasy. But what Wyatt forgot, what men like him always forget, is that I had already done the hardest part. I had survived years of emotional isolation, the being unseen, unheard, unloved. And now I was awake. And I was done waiting for permission to live. People don't wake up one morning and decide to destroy a marriage. Not all at once, anyway. It happens slowly. Like wood rotting beneath a glossy floor, everything appears solid until one day your foot crashes through. With Wyatt, the collapse came in small doses at first. Words sharpened by sarcasm. Affection replaced by performance. He began treating our life and me like a resume builder. Something to flaunt when it made him look successful. Something to hide when it didn't. Started showing most clearly at the hospital galas. There's a particular evening I still remember, almost like a fever dream. The annual Asheville General Winter Benefit, black tie, 400 guests, string quartet, the kind of evening that makes donors feel like royalty. I'd spent weeks helping the communications team put together the messaging package, branding, donor targeting, case studies. It was a major event for the hospital, and for Wyatt, who was nominated for a regional award. The whole night was drenched in elegance. And Wyatt, of course, was in his element. Hand on the shoulder of every executive, effortless charm, laughter calibrated for volume and effect. He introduced me as my wife, Jules, and quickly moved on to the next person. I was a prop. Not a partner. Not a contributor. Not a woman who had helped bring in the grants that paid for half the damn research that was being toasted that night. During the award ceremony, when Wyatt's name was announced, I clapped like the supportive wife I had trained myself to be. He stepped onto the stage, accepted the plaque, gave a brief speech, polished, humble bragging, carefully scripted, and thanked his incredible family for keeping him grounded. That was my moment. My mention. Grounded. Like an anchor. The cocktail hour afterward, I found myself standing near the bar with Dr. Priya Kumdar, a brilliant neurologist who'd once worked with me on a funding application. "I loved your piece in the quarterly report," she said, smiling. "The language around equity and outcomes, that was yours, right?" Before I could answer, Wyatt appeared beside me, slipping his arm possessively around my waist. "Oh, Jules writes all kinds of things," he said with a patronizing grin. "We try to keep her busy." I felt it like a slap. The smiling dismissal, the suggestion that my work was a hobby, something quaint to pass the time while the real adults made impact. Dr. Kumdar's expression cooled instantly. She excused herself, and I stood there, heart pounding, blinking hard against the sting behind my eyes. Later that night, I confronted him about it in the car. "Why would you say something like that to her?" I asked, gripping the seatbelt in my fist. Wyatt didn't look at me. "Say what?" "That you try to keep me busy. Like I'm some idle pet who needs stimulation." He laughed. "You're being dramatic," he said, shifting the car into gear. "Don't start one of your emotional spirals, Jules." It was a joke. A joke. Like my dignity was some light punchline. That night I didn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling of our master bedroom, the soft hum of the humidifier, the glow of his phone screen as he scrolled beside me, unbothered. That's when the resentment started calcifying. Over the next few months, Wyatt's cruelty became more overt. He'd correct me in front of friends, laugh at my ideas over dinner, dismiss my opinions in front of Aiden, even when we were discussing his future wedding plans. The worst came on a random Wednesday. He was home early, a rare occurrence, and I had just finished a Zoom meeting with a major research firm based in Seattle. They were looking to collaborate on a new funding model, and I'd spent days crafting a proposal. I was feeling energized, inspired. When I told Wyatt about the potential partnership, he didn't even look up from his tablet. "You're not flying out there," he said flatly. "I didn't say I was," I replied, trying to keep my voice calm. "We both know you hate logistics. And I need you here while I prep for the surgical board review." I blinked. "You need me here? To what? Grocery shop while you prep for your promotion?" He finally looked up. "Jules, I don't say this to be harsh, but you're not exactly irreplaceable." The silence in the room was deafening. "You mean at work?" I asked, my voice so quiet it barely escaped my throat. "I mean in general," he said. "You're consistent. But let's not pretend you're running the world." I don't remember what I said next. I think I just nodded and walked out of the room. Later that night, I went for a drive. No music. No destination. Just the sound of tires on pavement and the dull ache of realizing the man I married wasn't cruel by accident. He was cruel by nature. And I had been making excuses for years. That week, I started organizing my documents, dating my resume, quietly networking with contacts in Boston. I asked Archer gently if the offer still stood. He said yes, without hesitation. "I see what you do, Jules," he said. "You're brilliant. You lead with clarity. And people follow that." I cried after that call. Not because I was sad, but because it was the first time in years someone saw me whole. The final straw came 2 months later. We were invited to a hospital retreat, spouses included, at a lodge up in the Smoky Mountains. It was supposed to be restorative. Wyatt treated it like a networking fest. Dinner, seated between 2 younger surgeons and their wives, he told a story about how I used to write poetry in college. "She was obsessed with it," he said, laughing. "Used to fill entire notebooks with angsty lines. Thankfully, she found a more practical use for her writing, grant money. Way less romantic, way more useful." Everyone chuckled. Except me. I looked around the table and saw pity on the women's faces. Not at Wyatt. At me. And that was it. I was done. Done with shrinking myself to make him feel bigger. Done with tolerating humiliation dressed as wit. Done pretending that being someone's wife was a full-time identity. I wasn't just leaving him anymore. I was leaving the version of myself he had trained me to be. The next day, I emailed Archer. "Let's talk timelines," I wrote. "I'm ready." The first time Archer Langley touched my hand, it wasn't romantic. It wasn't bold. It was grounding. We were sitting on a bench outside the hospital's education wing after a long planning meeting for the Pediatric Research Fund. It was early spring. The air smelled like new leaves and distant rain. I just pitched a grant proposal strategy to the board. It had gone well, but my nerves hadn't quite caught up to the outcome. "I know that look," Archer said with a half-smile. "You're replaying every sentence in your head, wondering if you could have phrased something differently." I laughed, startled by the accuracy. "Guilty." "You were exceptional," he said simply. No flattery. No performance. Just a statement of fact. I looked down at my hands, folded in my lap, the wedding ring I hadn't taken off in 28 years catching the late sunlight like a lie. And then, with the gentlest motion, no pressure, no expectation, Archer reached over and touched my hand. Just a light contact. Warm. "Teddy." "You know," he said, "the entire board is used to people begging for funding. You walked in and showed them why it would be a mistake not to invest. That's rare." I felt something shift in me then. Not butterflies. Not infatuation. Something older. Something deeper. Recognition. This wasn't a man trying to save me. This was a man who saw I had already begun saving myself, and simply wanted to walk beside me while I did it. Over the next few weeks, our conversations grew more frequent. Archer would send articles he thought I'd find interesting. We'd exchange thoughts over email late at night, not flirtatious, just intellectually alive. Curious. Open. Then one evening, he asked me if I'd meet him for dinner. "Not a meeting," he said. "Not business. Just dinner. If you're comfortable with that." I surprised myself by saying yes. We met at a quiet place in the River Arts District, a renovated mill-turn bistro with soft jazz playing in the background and brick walls covered in local oil paintings. I wore black slacks and a silk blouse that had been sitting in my closet for months, one of those pieces I'd bought when I still believed Wyatt would notice. Archer stood when I arrived. He didn't look me up and down. He didn't say anything suggestive. He just smiled, touched my shoulder lightly, and pulled out my chair. Over grilled trout and wine, we talked about everything except work. Books. Travel. His life in Boston before moving to Asheville. His mother, who had been a civil rights attorney. The fact that he played jazz piano when he was younger. I told him about Aiden. About how I used to write poetry but gave it up because life got noisy. He didn't interrupt. He didn't laugh. He asked me to recite one. I blushed, sipped my wine, and then, tentatively, recited a short stanza I remembered by heart. Something I'd written in college about losing yourself in the service of someone else. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I can't believe that voice was hidden all these years." That night, as he walked me to my car, he didn't kiss me. He didn't even try. He just looked at me with an expression that made me feel real. Like he saw every scar and every strength and wanted all of it. And for the first time in years, I felt like a woman again. Not a role. Not a placeholder. Person. After that, things moved slowly, deliberately. Archer and I were careful. Discreet. Not because we were doing anything wrong, nothing physical happened for weeks, but because I wasn't ready. I needed space to feel this out. To own it. To trust it. He gave me that space. No pressure. No ultimatums. Instead, he gave me opportunity. That spring, he called me into his office, a beautiful glass-walled room that overlooked the campus lawn, and laid out a plan. "We're opening a new development branch in Boston," he said. "A full expansion for research grants, philanthropic outreach, and global partnerships." He paused. "I want you to run it." I blinked. Me? Jules, I've worked with a dozen strategists in 4 major cities. None of them can do what you do. You don't just write proposals. You create vision. You build momentum. You get people to believe in the impossible, and then you give them the plan to make it real. I felt tears welling, unbidden. Turned away slightly, embarrassed. Archer waited. "It's not that I don't want it," I said finally. "It's that no one's ever offered me something like this and actually meant it." He nodded. "Well, I do. And it's yours. The board has already signed off. You'd have full control of your team. And obviously, the salary would reflect the magnitude of the role." I laughed wetly. "Let me guess. Double. Almost triple," he said with a grin. I said yes. Not on the spot, but within 48 hours. I told myself I'd give Wyatt the courtesy of a conversation. That was the lie I told to feel moral. But in my heart, I knew we were past conversations. We were living in parallel fictions. His, a performance of dominance, mine, a quiet exit strategy. By early summer, Archer and I were seeing each other regularly. Publicly, we remained colleagues. Privately, we shared something that grew richer with every moment, not just attraction but admiration. Respect. Peace. It wasn't about running into each other's arms like in a romance novel. It was about walking towards something better with eyes open and spines straight. He never spoke ill of Wyatt. Never pushed. But he listened. When I told him about the night Wyatt laughed at my poetry, he said, "That says everything about him and nothing about your writing." When I told him about the gala, about being called a woman they try to keep busy, he said, "Let him think that. He's about to learn what busy women are capable of." And then, one night, as we sat on a bench overlooking the French Broad River at sunset, Archer turned to me and said, "I don't want to overstep. But if you do decide to leave, you won't be alone. Not professionally. Not personally." He didn't say, "I love you." It was too soon. But what he did say meant more. "You don't have to choose between power and peace. With me, you can have both." In that moment, I believed him. And that's when the plan began to take shape. Not just how to leave Wyatt, but how to walk into a future where I didn't have to apologize for being fully myself. No shrinking. No silence. Only sovereignty. Once I accepted Archer's offer, both professionally and emotionally, everything shifted. Not outwardly. I still cooked dinner most nights. Still responded politely when Wyatt grunted a hello or commented on the mail. Still attended fundraisers on his arm and smiled when people complimented how well we looked together. But inside I had moved on. It's a strange kind of power having a secret. A truth that belongs only to you, hidden just beneath the surface. I moved through our house like a ghost with a plan. Every step was deliberate, every silence strategic. I wasn't just enduring anymore, I was observing. And I saw everything. Wyatt, drunk on his own certainty, had become careless, emboldened, convinced that I was too broken, too loyal, or too dependent to ever leave. That I was some relic of our early life, comforting, predictable, harmless. He had no idea I was about to burn his narrative to the ground. Planning began subtly. First, I opened a private P.O. box downtown. Then a new bank account. I started transferring small sums, nothing dramatic, just enough to build reserves under the radar. Quietly, methodically. I reconnected with an old colleague, Serena Havens, a corporate attorney I'd once collaborated with on a health grant lawsuit. She specialized in workplace litigation and high net worth divorce. Smart as hell, discreet, and terrifying when she needed to be. "You're sure you want to do this quietly?" she asked during our first lunch meeting, a crisp salad between us and a document envelope beside her wineglass. "I don't want to play games," I said. "I want to be ready. And I want to win without raising my voice." She smiled, sharp and impressed. "Then we'll prepare like you're going into battle, and we won't fire a shot until the last second." With Serena's help, I began collecting credit card records, travel receipts, voicemails, screenshots. Wyatt wasn't exactly good at hiding his affair. Kelsey, the surgical nurse he'd been sneaking around with, left a breadcrumb trail of digital affection that would make a teenager blush. Dinner charges at rooftop bars. Hotel bookings for conferences that didn't exist. One especially bold message that read, "Still thinking about last night? My scrub top still smells like you, winking face." I printed it all. Documented everything. Meanwhile, Archer and I maintained professional distance in public, but in private, we were building something stronger than just affection. We were building alignment. He began looping me into confidential strategy meetings with the Boston team, introductions that were positioned as early collaboration but were, in reality, preparing me to lead. I signed an official offer letter with a generous relocation bonus and full housing coverage. I retained Serena to quietly review all contractual terms, not just with Velmont Health but with Wyatt's financials, our joint assets, and our prenup. Yes, we had one. Drafted back when Wyatt was just out of residency and insisted on protecting his future empire. At the time, I didn't mind. I had nothing to protect but a beat-up Corolla and a closet full of idealism. What Wyatt didn't anticipate was that 28 years later, the bulk of our net worth would stem from my real estate investments, my grant consulting firm, and the passive royalties from intellectual property I developed through nonprofit partnerships. The man who once told me you'd have nothing without me was about to learn just how wrong he was. But we didn't rush. The brilliance of the plan was in the restraint. We let Wyatt be Wyatt. Arrogant. Loud. Reckless. He bragged at dinners. Interrupted me at meetings. Once, when Archer was present, Wyatt made a crude comment about how hard it is to keep Jules entertained now that she's on the wrong side of 50. Archer didn't flinch. He just smiled, politely sipped his bourbon, and filed the remark away, a mental timestamp, another piece of documentation. At home, Wyatt began prepping for his own reveal. I could tell. The late-night phone calls. The smug little smirks at breakfast. The constant mentions of reinvention, and men like me still having options. He was planning something dramatic. He thought he was the star of the story. The hero making a bold, youthful escape. What he didn't realize was that I had already cast him in a different role, the outdated villain in someone else's origin story. Aiden, of course, had noticed the shift. He was too perceptive not to. One evening, while we were having lunch at a cafe near his office, he looked at me across his sandwich and said, "You seem different lately." "How so?" He shrugged. "Lighter. Like you're not trying so hard to keep everything held together anymore." I didn't deny it. Instead, I smiled. That's because I finally realized it's not my job to hold together something that someone else is trying to break. He sat back slowly, watching me. Does this have anything to do with Dad? I paused, then nodded. It has everything to do with me. His expression shifted, not shocked, not angry. Just grown. Understanding. I'm here for you, he said. Whatever you need. Just say the word. That moment gave me more strength than I think he'll ever know. With every passing week, Wyatt's performance escalated. He started making not-so-subtle digs about aging. About women who don't know when to let go. He was testing the waters, rehearsing lines for a monologue he hadn't yet delivered, believing he was preparing for his moment of power. Archer and I agreed. Let him have it. Let him believe the script is his. We chose the day together, Aiden's engagement dinner, not as a trap but as a mirror. If Wyatt wanted to make a show of his self-importance, we would simply allow him to do so, while holding a far sharper truth in our pocket. I knew he'd do it there. The self-aggrandizing speech. The dramatic declaration. I could feel it building in him like steam in a pressure cooker. He was dying for an audience. And I would give him one. Only it wouldn't go the way he imagined. Because Wyatt was planning to deliver a final blow. And I was preparing to deliver the last word. The vineyard glowed like something out of a wedding magazine. Long wooden tables lined the gravel patio, draped with ivory linens and string lights that swayed gently in the early evening breeze. In the distance, soft jazz floated from the small stage, and servers moved gracefully between guests with trays of roes and oysters. It was exactly how I had planned it, curated, elegant, perfect. Aiden and Emily stood near the center, glowing with that breathless kind of joy you only have when the future feels like a promise. I should have been taking it all in, absorbing the beauty, smiling at old friends. But I was watching Wyatt. He was working the room with the smug energy of a man convinced he owned it. Handshakes too firm, laughter too loud, eyes darting for maximum attention. He wore his favorite navy suit and a pink pocket square he only brought out when he wanted to be noticed. And trailing him, just a few paces behind as always, was Kelsey. She looked young. Not just in years but in presence, overly eager, too polished, the wide-eyed ambition of someone still convinced that proximity to power equals protection. No one seemed to know quite what to make of her. Wyatt had introduced her vaguely, calling her a close colleague. But the way she clung to his elbow, the way he refilled her glass without asking, it was clear something deeper was happening. And so was the tension. I caught glimpses of side eyes and hushed whispers as guests began to sense that something wasn't quite right. At our table, Aiden leaned toward me. "He's going to do something," he said softly. I nodded. "I know. Are you ready?" I looked at my son, the child I had raised, the man he had become, thoughtful, strong, good. And I smiled. I've never been more ready. Moments later, Wyatt tapped his wine glass with the back of his fork. The soft ting-ting-ting echoed like a bell tolling across the courtyard, and the music stopped. All eyes turned toward him. He stood confidently, arms slung around Kelsey's chair, and gave the crowd his best benevolent patriarch smile, the one he wore in hospital board photos and donor campaigns. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, projecting like a man giving a TED Talk. "It means the world to Emily and Aiden, and of course to Jules and me." He gave me a tight, performative nod. "And while tonight is about new beginnings," he continued, lifting his glass slightly, "I want to take a moment to share something personal. Something important." Across the table, Archer sat motionless, his fingers gently drumming on his glass stem. I met his eyes. It was time. Wyatt straightened his shoulders and smiled wider. "After 28 wonderful years of marriage," he said, "Jules and I have agreed that it's time for a new chapter. Life is about growth, change, passion. And sometimes that means making hard choices." Crowd tensed. Even the waitstaff paused. Wyatt turned toward me as if granting me some noble acknowledgement and delivered the line he'd clearly practiced in the mirror 100 times. I've met someone who reminds me of what it means to feel alive again. Someone who sees me, appreciates me, challenges me in all the right ways. He placed his hand on Kelsey's shoulder. She beamed, utterly unaware of the moment she was about to become part of. I know this might come as a surprise, he said with the sanctimonious air of a politician, but I'm choosing to live authentically. I'm leaving Jules, and I wish her nothing but the best as we both step into this new season of life. There it was. The moment. Climax of his little play. He sat down with satisfaction, smiling like he'd just delivered an award-winning monologue. Around the table, people stared, unsure if they'd witnessed something brave or something appalling. And that's when I stood up. I didn't rush. I didn't raise my voice. I just smoothed the fabric of my dress, lifted my champagne flute, and looked around the table, at every shocked face, every sympathetic eye, every witness. How generous of you, Wyatt, I said, my voice calm, even amused. But I have an announcement, too. His head snapped up. I'm also leaving you, I continued, turning toward him. And like you, I've met someone who sees me, who values what I bring into a room. Someone brilliant, respected, honest. Wyatt's smirk faltered. My eyes didn't leave his. His name is Archer Langley. The sound of glass clinking stopped completely. Wyatt blinked. What did you just say? I took a step closer to him, not threatening, just steady. You know him, don't you? I said lightly. Your boss, the COO, the man who's been watching you come in late, miss meetings, and flirt with subordinates in the staff lounge? Wyatt went pale. Kelsey looked between us, confused. Wait, what is this? Archer stood then. Slowly. Calmly. He didn't raise his voice either. He didn't need to. Good evening, everyone, he said to the group, buttoning his jacket with measured grace. Forgive the interruption. But since this has now become a matter of public record, I'll clarify a few things. He stepped beside me but didn't touch me. His presence was enough. Jules has recently accepted the position of Director of Strategic Development for our new Boston division, Archer said, his voice carrying easily across the patio. She'll be leading our national expansion strategy. A collective murmur swept through the crowd. Wyatt looked like he'd been punched. You can't just... Oh, and Wyatt, Archer interrupted smoothly, his tone still perfectly cordial. We'll discuss your recent HR violations on Monday, including your relationship with Nurse Cameron and several discrepancies in your surgical reporting. Kelsey's face blanched. This isn't happening, Wyatt hissed. You can't be serious. Oh, I'm very serious, Archer replied. And as of this moment, your administrative privileges are being reviewed. Color drained from Wyatt's face. His jaw worked uselessly as if trying to form some rebuttal. Crowd wasn't silent anymore. Whispers passed like fire, shock, glee, disbelief. And then Aiden stood. Dad, he said loud and clear. You've humiliated my mother in front of this entire family. And you've done it thinking no one would ever stand up to you. He turned to me. But she just did. And so did I. The tears welled up before I could stop them, but they didn't fall. Not out of sadness. Out of release. I had waited years to be seen. To be heard. Now the whole room was watching. And I wasn't small anymore. I looked back at Wyatt, whose world had collapsed in real time. Career, mistress, marriage, pride, all unraveling before him like thread from a cheap suit. I raised my glass one final time. To new seasons, I said. And then I sat down. Archer joined me. And Wyatt Colburn, the man who once told me I was forgettable, sat frozen in a chair he'd once believed no one could take away from him. I didn't look back that night. Not at the table. Not at Wyatt. not at the faces still reeling from the spectacle they'd just witnessed. I didn't need to. I had said what I came to say. And more importantly, I had finally done what I had needed to do for years. I walked off the patio with Archer beside me, the gravel crunching beneath our steps, the mountain air cool and clean against my skin. My heart wasn't racing. My hands weren't shaking. I felt still. Complete. That night, I slept deeper than I had in a decade. Not because everything was resolved, but because I no longer owed any part of myself to someone who treated me like I was disposable. The fallout was swift. By Monday, Wyatt was under formal review at the hospital. His affair with Kelsey, now very public, triggered an internal investigation. HR had already compiled informal reports, inappropriate comments to junior staff, unexplained absences, inflated billing for surgical time. Archer didn't fire him that day. That would have been too easy. Instead, he let the system do what it was built to do. Within 2 weeks, Wyatt was quietly removed from all high-level cases. His speaking engagement at the regional orthopedic conference was reassigned. And the promotion he'd been chasing for the last 2 years? Gone. He didn't fight it. 'Cause there was nothing to fight with anymore. I'd left the house the morning after the engagement dinner. Not in a flurry of emotion, not with boxes stacked in a cab, just a small suitcase and a pre-signed lease agreement for a quiet apartment overlooking Pack Square. Archer helped me carry things up the stairs, but he didn't stay. He kissed my cheek, squeezed my hand, and told me, "This is your space now. Build it for you." And I did. I filled it with sunlight, plants, old poetry books, a French press I hadn't used in years. I played music out loud again, not to fill the silence but to dance in it. I stopped straightening my hair every day. I wore lipstick when I felt like it, not because someone might notice. I lit candles for myself and cooked dinner like it was a gift, even if no one else was there to eat it. I was alone. But I was never lonely. Archer and I stayed close but gave each other space. We didn't rush. We didn't label. What we had was already strong enough to withstand distance, time, and healing. 3 months later, we moved to Boston together. I didn't tell Wyatt. There was nothing left to say. He and Kelsey had fizzled, unsurprisingly. She'd stuck around for a few weeks, but once the promotion evaporated and the invitations stopped coming, she ghosted him, moved to Phoenix, started working at an urgent care clinic. Last I heard, Wyatt was renting a modest condo outside town and was consulting part-time. No hospital privileges. No staff. Just echoes. The divorce was clean thanks to Serena. I kept my assets. Kept the Range Rover and the wine fridge. I didn't want either. Aiden visited us in Boston that fall. He and Emily had just gotten back from their honeymoon in Lisbon, and we took them to a small Italian place in the North End. Over espresso and tiramisu, he looked across the table at me and said, "I've never seen you like this." "Like what?" I asked. "Like you're not carrying anything anymore." I didn't reply right away. Just smiled and looked at Archer, who was listening quietly, his hand resting casually over mine. "I think," I said slowly, "I finally set it all down." Boston felt like another life. And maybe it was. I walked into boardrooms now without apology. I presented funding strategies to international partners with zero hesitation. My name, Jules Calderwood, started appearing on grant advisory panels, TEDx invitations, even a short profile in Forbes Women. But none of it felt like validation. Felt like restoration. The life I had dreamed of, the one I'd silenced for so long, was now unfolding before me. Not because someone gave it to me, but because I finally gave myself permission to stop surviving and start choosing. Archer and I spent weekends in Cape Cod. He taught me how to play jazz piano. I read him old poems from my journals, the ones I used to hide. We cooked dinner together in our apartment overlooking the harbor, and some nights we danced barefoot in the kitchen with the windows open. I never imagined life in my 50s could feel like a beginning. But it does. Feels like everything I was meant for is finally mine to hold. And when I look back, not with regret but with clarity, I realize something. Wyatt didn't ruin my life. He exposed what needed to be rebuilt. He gave me the final push I didn't know I needed. Because sometimes the moment you're broken in public is the same moment you're reborn in private.